said, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and I'll just observe. All right, so just relax and enjoy the show.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate that. Good evening, Miss Lisa Forbes. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you, Bishop Ward?
I'm doing wonderful, which is good. You could have rested on your laurels and not have come back to this process, but we're thankful that you did, because the endorsement and ratings process is very important, especially as it relates to coming back into the African American community. You're being the people as you get ready for the general election. So we're thankful that you are back with us again, and we're going to ask you some questions. You'll have 20 minutes to answer these questions, and depending on the length of your answers, it will determine on how many of these questions we get through. You are running for the Court of Appeals.
Correct.
And we're interested in make sure that you're going to the level of court, which many of us are really not that experienced and or familiar with. So tell me, how will you right the wrongs of a flawed criminal justice system that are preyed upon?
Bishop, ask her who she is first. We got to ask her who she is.
Ask her about herself first. I'm telling you. Tell me about yourself first. I'm sorry. Tell about yourself.
Well, I'm Lisa Forbes, and I'm running for the Court of Appeals. I'm running for the seat that was vacated by Melody Stewart when she was elected to the Supreme Court. And I am, first want to say, very grateful for the endorsements of both GPAC and FinPAC, and also the high rating that the NAACP awarded to me in the primary process. Not only was it personally very gratifying to me to have had your stamp of approval, but it also was of, I think, material significance to me emerging from the primary as the Democratic nominee. The support and the help that I received from all three organizations was immeasurable. So I want to say, first off, thank you, and make sure that you know and understand how deeply I appreciate the help that you gave me in the primary. I also recognize that now it's a new day. And so to your point, Bishop, of course I would be here, because these are this is an important review process, and obviously these are three very important organizations here in Cuyahoga County in particular. So a little bit about myself is that I'm a practicing attorney. I've been a courtroom lawyer for 27 years. My entire career has been spent as a courtroom lawyer, working in courts all over the state of Ohio at every level: trial courts, courts of appeals, and the Supreme Court. In addition to my work as a lawyer, I've always been a very active and involved member of our community. I have, for almost 20 years, served in the voter protection program of the Ohio Democratic Party, election after election, going to polling places and to ensure that people who show up, who want to vote, are allowed to vote, and that their votes can count. And I've done that in virtually every role that the Ohio Democratic Party has for running the voter protection program. And as I said, I've been doing it, I believe, since the inception of Ohio's voter protection program some 20 years ago. So that's near and dear to my heart, is the importance of people's right to vote, obviously. But it's not obvious because it is work that needs to be done, because people do indeed try to interfere and suppress the vote. So I also am very involved in our community as a member of the board of directors of the Centers for Families and Children. I'm not just a board member, though. I'm a chair of a committee. I'm chair of the committee with fiscal oversight and fiduciary responsibility for the Head Start programming. And also we have the direct programmatic oversight over the community health center. So we're a federally qualified health center. And then I also and I've done myriad other things over the years, but Those are two. I'm a mother and a wife. I've been married for 28 years, working on 29, and I have 3 tremendous kids. So in a nutshell, that's me.
Okay, how will you help right the wrongs of a flawed criminal justice system that has preyed upon poor people and minorities?
I think that the courts are uniquely positioned to right those wrongs, but not alone, of course. I think there is also need for policy change, legislative change that will address many of the issues that are wrong with our criminal justice system today. Sentencing requirements are one example. You had asked in your questionnaire if I've read the new Jim Crow. I have. I do firmly embrace the notion that we need to end this so-called war on drugs. It doesn't do anyone any good, and it's not helping to rid our communities of crime, but it's in fact probably generating the seeds for more and worse crime than a simple, possession charge, for example. But that's legislative. What can the courts do? What the courts can do here, we do have indeterminate sentences. I hope to be on the appellate court, was a sentence that was meted out that it was an exercise of judicial discretion on the part of the trial court judge. Was that an appropriate exercise of discretion, or was it an abuse of discretion? That's what a court of appeals judge gets to look at. I would always look at that question through the lens of knowing and understanding the injustice that we've seen over the many years of the war on drugs. So that's one example at the Court of Appeals level, but I don't think it ends there. And I did say legislatively policy needs to change, but what pushes legislative change comes from many different directions, one of which can indeed be the courts, and also through the bar associations as well. But through the courts, participation in different and various organizations such as the Sentencing Commission. Judges have a place on that type of an advisory panel through the Ohio Supreme Court. And I would work to participate in activities like that so that I can help to drive policy change. So those are some examples. I think that the last that I do want to touch on is that as a judge on the Court of Appeals, you have opportunity to write not only the main decision and speak for the court, but sometimes when you disagree, you have to disagree and you have to hold your ground and you have to write a dissent. And you have to write a dissent that articulates the rationale for the disagreement so that you can help to build the blocks, that will move policy, that will move legislation, and that will move the development of the law, because sometimes there's room for the law to develop outside of statute, but through the common law. And the way that grows and develops is through things like writing dissents. And I would be unafraid to do that.
Okay. What new or different perspective will you bring to the Court of Appeals?
Oh, I will bring definitely a new or different perspective to the Court of Appeals for a couple of reasons. One is that really on the court today, there is nobody that practiced. Prior to going to the court, there's nobody on the court today that practiced the kind of law that I practice. My area of expertise is complicated, complex litigation, including class actions and all manner of complex litigation. The only person who comes close to that on the court today is Michelle Sheehan. And I'm sure if you ask Michelle, I mean, she's had a smattering of complex matters, no doubt, but really her focus was on tort law, and mine is on complex litigation. Okay. So, I mean, there's that perspective that, like I said, is literally nobody else on the court practiced that kind of law.
Have you practiced and do you have experience with criminal litigation as well as civil litigation?
I do not. Quite frankly, I've never stood next to a defendant during a sentencing. I have, however, I have experience with the grand jury from the perspective of representing witnesses who've been called before a grand jury. And I have assisted and litigated with a habeas proceeding, which is, you know, the ultimate appeal after a criminal sentencing. But I want to just allay any concerns, though, that the criminal law is a, you know, is a statutory body of law, largely, and it is when you go to law school for 3 years. Criminal law is one class. It's one substantive class. The other substantive classes that go on over the course of the 3 years you're in law school are what I practice, all the different areas of law. And so I am confident in my ability to come to know, understand, and fairly apply the criminal law. But that's just, it's interesting because people always ask that question. But I don't think people ever ask the question when in these interviews of, have you ever practiced civil law? And really the work at the Court of Appeals is 50-50. 50% of the cases at the Court of Appeals are criminal law, and 50% of the cases at the Court of Appeals are civil law. And so you do need a mix of both.
Okay. What do you perceive as the greatest obstacle to justice in the appeals division? And as you're going to that, as you're desirous of going to that position, what do you see would be your greatest obstacle on that bench?
The greatest obstacle.
To the best of ability, answer.
Right. I think that's an interesting question. I think the greatest obstacle, well, I suspect that the greatest obstacle, I'm not on the bench yet, but what I anticipate being a significant obstacle will be the obligation of a judge on the Court of Appeals to apply the law that is the law of the state of Ohio. And that is the fundamental oath that any judge sitting on any court in Ohio has to abide by. And so that will be frustrating in situations where the law mandates an outcome that is dissatisfying in terms of any individual's circumstances. And I can give you an example of sort of what I'm talking about. When I was a judicial law clerk right out of law school, my first job out of law school was clerking at a trial court, and we had a case in our court where, and this was back in the early 90s, where a gentleman had been picked up as a mule. He was carrying drugs in the trunk of his car. And the sentencing guidelines were relatively new. And I was in the federal system at that point. The federal sentencing guidelines were relatively new and were very harsh. And this guy had 3 kids, and he was employed, and it was just a terrible, terrible story. And the minimum sentence that he could get was 5 years under the sentencing guidelines. And the judge I was clerking for was working to try to work around the sentencing guidelines. And that's the type of situation that I would envision it as being the most frustrating to occur. Now, he was a trial court judge, and so he had some tools available to him that he was able to employ, not the least of which was he just refused to sentence the guy. He just refused to do it. In other instances, he just refused to follow the guidelines. And so he was making an important statement. And so I understand that those are available options as well.
You make me want to ask another question, but let me follow the guidelines because you'll be fussing at me if I don't. Do you
Sure.
believe that there's an underrepresentation of people of color in the justice system?
An underrepresentation
Yes.
in the justice system, not on the side of the incarcerated. I mean, on the side of the incarcerated, I think the statistics don't really leave room for much discussion on this point, right? Like in Ohio, if I've got it right, it's like 13% of Ohio's population is African American, and what is it, like 47% of the population of Ohio's prisons, I think,
Yeah.
if I have the numbers right, are African American. That's ridiculous. I mean, that defies logic. So no, in the operation of the justice system, in terms of judges and prosecutors and lawyers, I think that the percentage of attorneys, it's, at least in my practice, doesn't mirror the percentage of minorities in the population, in particular Blacks in the population. So in that instance, in terms of as it being a tool of the justice system, yeah, I think that minorities are underrepresented, and so I think that disconnect is all the more glaring and offensive.
If you were on the Court of Appeals, if you were able to, how would you work to try and solve this problem?
I think the same tools that I talked about at the outset in response to your first question are the things that I would do and will do, because I have no interest in going to the Court of Appeals so that I can sit back and rest on my laurels. I intend to go to the Court of Appeals so that I can make a difference. I think it is incumbent on everyone to do what they can to create the world that they want to live in, and the world I want to live in doesn't include this senseless prosecution of people for the senseless and selective prosecution of people.
So with all of the unrest that been at in country here in the past few weeks, the death of George Floyd, and you desiring to be on Court of Appeals and on the judicial bench, what is your vision for the future of our judicial system? What is your vision?
My vision for the future of our judicial system would be one that actually did live up to the promise that ours is a government of laws and not of men, that we would enforce our laws in a way that is fair to everyone that comes before the court. But that, what we've really seen, or perhaps me, what I think is really glaring and has come to light in just stark relief, is on the criminal justice side of things, that has to start at the policing level. If the policing is only being done in selective areas, and only selective matters are coming to a grand jury, and the grand jury is only indicting at certain levels, then the courts only have an opportunity to rule on the cases that are brought before it, right? We're static. The courts are static. They only handle what comes to them. And so reform has to start long before you get to the courts. And I'm not absolving the courts of the need for reform, but reform has to start long before anybody gets to the courts. It has to start in the way that we're policing. It has to start in the way that the way that grand juries are indicting. And on the court perspective, I think one of the simple things, and I will credit, I've had conversations with Jerry about this, but one of the simple things that can be done is we can keep track, right? We can keep track of how long we're putting people away. And we can keep track of simple basic information about them. And we can keep track of which judges are doing what, so that we can see whether or not, in fact, certain individuals are meting out inappropriate sentences, certain individuals, certain judges, so that we can see whether or not people are, and which judges those are, right? So we can do it in real time. And so we can use that information to inform how we are making decisions going forward. And for the Court of Appeals, as I said at the outset, one of the things that the Court of Appeals looks at is, was the exercise of discretion in imposing any kind of sentence, was that an abuse of discretion? And that decision can be informed by doing things like maintaining information, a database of sentencing patterns.
So do you believe that police officers should be looked at and held to the same level of credibility as the citizens?
Yes, I don't think that police officers should get any special pass because they're a police officer.
If you are elected,
1
how
minute.
would you use the power of the bench? Is that it, Jerry? Okay.
Now she has 1 minute.
Okay. If elected, how would you use the power of the bench to bring about important changes to a judicial system that disproportionately affects people?
Well, I would use the ability to write decisions, the ability to write dissents. And I do, as I said earlier, I do intend to be actively engaged in policy discussions, not just to sit back and wait for the cases to come, but to do that, because that's the professional part. But there's also the opportunity to take the robe and participate in policy discussions, such as at the Sentencing Commission and things like that. And I would hope to be able to be engaged in that, involved in that as well.
Well,
All right,
thank you,
that's it.
Ms. Ford. That's it. Thank you, Ms. Ford, for participating in
All
our
right.
Zoom conference as well as in our rating and endorsement process. We thank you, and you'll be hearing from us soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you
God bless
taking the
you.
time and being creative like this. Thanks a lot.